All right. Welcome back to the Shaggy Dog Philosophy Podcast. I am the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. And today I want to try something different again. I want to guide you through a meditation. But not in the way you might think. Meditation comes into the modern American English vernacular, or lexicon is the word I want to use, by way of Zen Buddhism, which is, in a lot of ways, maybe the most recent development in Buddhism. It evolved in Japan out of a Taoist and a Taoist blending of the Buddhist ideas called Zen. And Buddhism is a packaging of the Hindu Vedas to go, so to speak. It was designed to be proselytized east and west. And what did happen is that it was able to get a foothold in China. And so it successfully proselytized east. The proselytization process west looks like Gnostic Christianity. So, in the early part of the 20th century, as what I now understand is called the higher thought movement, or even the higher thought religion, was taking a foothold throughout among the intelligentsia of the 19th and 20th centuries. Buddhism, how do I want to say this? Buddhism got sucked up in the New Age movement is not correct. The reintroduction, I should say, of Buddhism to the Western tradition by the likes of, and maybe specifically, H.P. Blavatsky, the way her kind of Vedic scriptural interpretation played out in combination with the general New Age movement culminated in the 1970s in a kind of Buddhist revival. I don't even think that's the right word. A Buddhist awakening in the American consciousness, which has sort of culminated in the mindfulness movement among corporate types. Okay, so mindfulness meditation is the kind of meditation that you're most likely to be familiar with. And mindfulness meditation is about taking time in the day to be mindful, that is, to allow your mind to be filled with thoughts of your life. And so what it means is to take however long you meditate, whether it be 60 seconds or 60 minutes or whatever. And when I say that meditate, what you more than likely think I mean is to sit quietly and close your eyes and initiate a sort of waking dream state. And that is within the Venn diagram of things that meditation is, within the circle of meditation. But the word meditation, it just means deep and intentional thought in the English language by way of Latin, which did not have any Buddhism in it. The language didn't have any Buddhism. Now, that's an interesting thing to say with my recent, one might even say, obsession with the Indo-Aryan people of yore, the genetic, I don't know what you want to say, the genotype, I think is the correct term. But the kind of meditation that I want to guide you on is not a Zen type meditation. It's not a mindful type meditation. The kind of meditation that I want to take you on is the kind of meditation that did make its way into the Western tradition by way of such luminaries as Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Plotinus, and maybe even Jesus. But I've been thinking a lot about Jesus, and whether it belongs here or not, I've been wondering whether Jesus weren't a naif. And so, in thinking about intellect, which is how I came to all of these things, I have recorded multiple podcasts and written the script for 2 others, trying to explore and talk about the subject of intellect in the way that my peers and contemporaries seem able to do. But because I have habituated the kind of meditation that I want to guide you through today, I find myself thinking more deeply and more intentional about every question that I have, and thus I chase too many questions at once, which is what drove Friedrich Nietzsche and Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and Kierkegaard and my type. It drives us insane. And I know this as fact, and I know this as scientific fact that's been observed over and over again, because William James talks about it in The Varieties of Religious Experience when he says, and I'm of course paraphrasing, that effectively people who have visionary states and who undergo the religious process are also undergoing a psychopathic experience. And so the broadly psychopathic mindset, and the word he uses for when he says psychopathic is not what we mean when we call somebody either a psycho or a sociopath. But when we call someone a psycho or a sociopath, I believe his name is Ronson, the same man who wrote the book The Men Who Stare at Goats. He is, if I'm not entirely wrong, I listened to him talk about this, he is effectively where our understanding, or rather our usage, I should say, because I need to avoid, for the purposes of this podcast and this meditation, we're going to be avoiding using the words understanding and intelligent and all of the words that come out of intelligent, intellect, etc. We're going to avoid using consciousness, and we're going to avoid using conscience. We're going to, if I'm able to remember my own rules, and if I'm not, I would like you to remember that when I use those words, what I mean to say is common sense. And common sense used to be called wisdom, but we're going to avoid mystical words, and we're going to avoid words with mystical geneses, mystical backgrounds. And so words like understanding, intellect, consciousness, these words that I've said that we need to refer to and we need to remember as common sense. And this is what I mean by meditating. We need to remember, as we're meditating, we need to be deeply thinking about the words we're using and the words they mean, what they mean, and then what we need to be asking ourselves, because we've come to this space to meditate in the way that philosophers meditate, not in the way that Buddhists meditate, and not in the way that Christians meditate. What we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves not just what do the words mean, but why do they mean what they mean? And then we're also going to ask, how have they been used? And then we're going to ask ourselves the phrase, why not? And that is an open-ended question in our thinking. But what we want to do is we want to habituate asking those questions and seeking those answers in this space. And that's the guided meditation we're going to go on today. And so what that means from you is that you can exercise any breathing rituals that you like. You can put on candles, you can put on soft music, if you like hard music, if that's what helps you think. Like I tend to think better with loud music. But what we're going to do is we're going to practice a particular kind of listening. And now I've forgotten the nomenclature, but what we're going to think of it as is intentional listening. I was introduced to this as just the phrase listening well. And so when we listen well, we don't listen to respond, and we don't listen to compare ourselves to what is said. When we listen closely, or when we practice intentional listening, what we're listening for is the speaker's meaning. And now I am naturally telling you in a vulnerable space that what I want you to do is listen for my meaning and not listen to the potentially harmful things I'm saying. And I've been thinking about that a great deal as well, because what I have been doing, if the things that I've opened this with have not illuminated it, is I've been studying cultists. And what I'm not is a cultist. I'm a philosopher, and a folk philosopher at that. I'm a folk philosopher who always mistook himself for a shaman. So what I'm not trying to do is organize a religion. You can organize a religion after me, but I'm going to resist it in the same way that Martin Luther did, because I think that Martin Luther might be one of my personal heroes. I have yet to dive into his work, because I'm afraid that he is one of my personal heroes, and my tendency with my personal heroes is either to destroy them in an effort to be greater than them, or to find out that I should have asked what it means about me that this particular person was my hero. And so, in trying to understand what intellect even means, and how we could measure it, and how we could choose in the 90s at the very latest is my knowledge, we could choose to sort children by one intelligence quotient test. These are questions that have haunted my life. I grew up in North Carolina, in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I was a part of the AG, or academically gifted system. I didn't understand it. My mother was very proud of it. And what I have always sensed my whole life is that the education system was trying to create a generational genius, or at least it was trying to identify who the potential generational geniuses are. And what I, in my naivete, which is sort of why I wonder whether Jesus weren't naive, because again, one of my personal heroes, and I keep finding there's some tragic flaw in my personal heroes that really, what it does is it challenges me and anyone else who chooses to elevate this person to hero status. It challenges us to be greater, that is the promise of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil in the Bible, is that we can become like God. And what God can do is God can judge good and evil. And so a question that I keep finding myself asking as I study cultists, and as I have been obsessed with religion my entire life, is how cultists, but specifically religious figureheads, can ignore their own evil, the evil that they do. And the answer is that it's naturally that thought experiment that I always run through with people that want to take me on as a teacher, and it's the question: is the wolf evil? And now the way it used to be presented was as, is the lion evil? But we in the North American Western Hemisphere, those of us from European stock most specifically, are very far away from lions in our genetic memory, but we're very close to wolves. It's only very recently that wolves were extincted in Europe, and it's only very recently that wolves haven't been a present terror among human beings in North America. And it's an increasingly present terror in the more populated cities like New York and LA to have quadrupedal terrors like wolves and coyotes. And so the question becomes, is the wolf evil? And so if you live in one of these population centers and your baby is snatched away by a wolf, the answer is yes. That wolf has done evil to me. And by the system with which we gauge standards in this northwestern hemisphere, if you like, is by deeds. We say, because of the Christian tradition, we say that a person is both what they do and their intentions. So what they think. And the most expedient way to judge a person is by what they value. And thus, virtue signaling, that is, good deeds or good works, or being seen being good, has become the prime standard, or rather the prime gauge by which we judge a person's goodness. But we all know, because of the arguments that were happening circa 2015 online, that just because a person does good deeds and is seen doing good deeds doesn't mean that when they're not seen, they're not being evil. Which brings us to the question, is a wolf evil? And it does pose, and it does ask the question, does a tree that fall in the woods and no one's around to hear it make a sound? So, if no, let's not do that, because you're going to suggest that I'm projecting. Let's say we have cult leader X, and cult leader X brings in, let's say, $2.5 billion, $2.5 billion a year annually, and all of that goes to charitable organizations, and none of those charitable organizations have ever had a scandal. No one that's ever worked for them has ever had a scandal. They do objective good in the community that doesn't have traceable long-term negative side effects. But he enjoys once a month, 12 times a year, sex with an underage child. All of his deeds, outwardly, are good. In fact, great. Mathematically, provably great. But once a year, 12 times a year, for every year that he's been doing it until the day he dies, he hurts someone. And that someone, because of the way cult works, may or may not, like Dracula's brides, I learned last night, know that they have been hurt, may not even believe that they've been hurt. And then we get back to the question, is a wolf evil? And that does ask, does a tree that falls in the woods when no one is around to observe it make a sound? And a question that I've been asking a lot, whether vampires, a metaphor for malignant contagion, plague, are redeemable, if there is a redemption possible for a vampire at the end of their story. And whether vampires get an end to their story, because contagion is going nowhere. Humans are going to remain determined to make sure of that. And so there are a couple ways you could approach the tree falling in the woods. From the esoteric perspective, it requires human observation for something to be materially real and to be said to have existence. And so, as I was looking for intellect, what I kept finding is what I had always found, because I spent a decade of my life as intensely interested as I get on the question of the near-death experience and out-of-body consciousness. And what I found is a general insistence in the scientific community that when a tree falls, it generates sound waves. And whether anyone hears those sound waves, whether there's an organism around to observe them, the tree's falling sends out sound waves, and those sound waves create noise that is there to be heard, but there's no one there to observe it. The problem becomes that that explanation is not actually what we observe to be true, because what we observe to be true, once we get in and we start to actually experiment with, and interestingly enough, double blind, which means observe ourselves not observing, what we find is that trees only fall when we see them falling. Otherwise, they fell, potentially, or they were that way specifically for the observer. They had never been anything at all, and then there was an observer to see a fallen tree. This is what the esoteric tells us, and the quantum, in demonstrating that electrons can only be said to exist in any one place at any one time. They can only be said to be doing that when observed by an observer. That suggests that what we know to be true from observing the human brain, that our surroundings are only what our surroundings are like when we observe them. And so this asks a question that the esoteric tradition was never adequately able to adequately able to answer. And that is, well, if the tree has only fallen for my benefit and doesn't make a sound, because it has only fallen, is it post hoc of my having observed it having been fallen? That means that I am in some way taking part in, or maybe the very creator of the universe itself. And so intellect is an exploration of that, of to what degree we actually create the universe. Because a question that's posed is, if my surroundings are only what they are insofar as I observe them, and that's how things can be subtly different between my visits in a room, and I can't know it, but I can have the uncanny sense that something is different, and I only become aware of what it is after I know what it is. And now, as a chain of cause and effect, that seems like the obvious. If you're pretty good at math, you seem, and you're familiar with Bill Engvall, you know that the last place you find something, or rather, the place that you find something is in the last place that you looked. Because if you continued to look for your car keys, lost, misplaced car keys, after you found them, you're not, what are you doing? What is that? What is that? Explain that, right? But what we believe to be true is that our visual field contains all of the information that is available to us. Another way to better say that is that we have access to all of the information in our visible field simultaneously. And the inclination is to believe that, for instance, I'm sitting in a messy room, that if I look straight ahead of me in the messy room, I will be able to take in all of the various objects that have littered the room simultaneously, and I'll be able to be aware of them, and I'll be able to know them and manipulate them in my mind. But what is actually true is that we're only able to actually look at and be aware of what we're actually looking at, i.e. what we're actually observing, and what we're actually manipulating with our mind's eye, so to speak, what we're actually manipulating with our mind's eye, that what our eyes see, our brain takes in all this visual information, but then what it does is very much like a camera, like what we do in movies, it very much filters out everything except for the very one thing that we're looking at. So, the things in the room that you're looking at, by that thinking, are only there when you're looking at it. There is a non-zero chance that when you've misplaced your car keys, what's happened is that you forgot to remember where you put them, and then they literally dematerialized from the universe because there was no longer anything observing them, and no longer your brain observing them in the abstract, in the mind's eye, in the what the New Age likes to call the fourth or the fifth dimension. And then they only rematerialized when you willed them into the last place you found them. And then if you've read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and if you've watched either Blade Runner movie, or if you have any interest in sci-fi between the publication of the book and the movie, you have a pretty solid foundation to begin to think about implanted memories. And one of the things that really unsettled my worldview and my ability to sort of make sense of which of these two things on the yin-yang of the universe is there for us to explore and observe, and the universe is there because we explore it and observe it, was the very real phenomena of fake memories, where you can invent, your brain is actually designed and very good at inventing whole memories. And so recently, I kind of I've been revisiting in an effort to reconnect with who I have been at the various times in my life where I was ego dominant. I've been trying to remember who I was, and maybe to try to rebuild my personality with what I've learned in an intentional and mindful listening to myself over the course of time kind of way. So I've been revisiting Forteana and the weird, because that's kind of how I got to religion, was through the uncanny experiences that were happening to me, and asking, well, why? But then why not me? Right? And then why not other question? Why not other things? And so why not Bigfoot? Or why not alien visitations? Why aren't they out there? You know, and what seems to be happening in situations like the I Am cult, or the May Otis Blackburn cult, or Christian Science or Adventism or Mormonism or I had one specifically that I wanted to point to. The alien abductions and alien visitation of the 1970s all seems to be the same thing. And the I Am movement captures that they capture it pretty clearly, if you're familiar with the I Am movement. If you're not familiar with the I Am movement, ask me and I'll dive into it for you in a meaningful way. Or you can also, I think her name is Emily Louise, something like that. She did a really good episode, and so anyway, I've been diving into that stuff, and the most recent that I want to talk about is the Montauk experiments. And so the Montauk experiments seem to be very clearly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about fake memories, and how fake memories seem to be socially constructed for the purposes of having a shared narrative. And having a shared narrative means having a shared observation point. And so what happens in these movements seems to be, these movements among these people, if you want to say among these visionary movements, what seems to happen when there's a visionary cultist of any ilk, wherever they are in time or place, is that they have a powerful imaginary experience. And what seems to be the case is that the people that have these extremely powerful imaginary experiences are people who previously either were or had been disinclined to be imaginative at all. And now this, having said that, I can prove it a little bit, because the higher thought movement, as related to us now by William James in his various lectures, and specifically for this, the varieties of religious experience, when he called visionary prophets, let's say, psychopaths, he describes his psychopathy in the terms that we would describe today as bipolar. And I believe that the term that we used when I was a child was bipolar mania, not bipolar depression. And today I think the nomenclature is bipolar type 2. And I believe that what they've learned is that it's not either mania or depression that divide the two, where what they've learned is that it's the cycle. So there are long cycle and there are short cycle bipolars. Short cycle bipolars bounce based on their triggers, and they're basically their environmental stimuli. They're just in a complete fight or flight reactionary mode at all times. They're never in what is understood in the 19th century and what we could say today, what we would understand today. They never occupy a higher plane of thought or a higher mode of thought. The higher mode of thought being the ability to step above the present moment and look into the future. Okay, well, the idea that there are levels of thought comes out of the higher thought religion of the 19th and 20th centuries. So we're back to where we began, and this is going to circle a lot, probably because I might be the kind of person, I relate a lot to the kind of people that, I've forgotten his name, William James talked about, because specifically he describes how you make a visionary. So when I'm about to describe what happens to them from their perspective, it's more important to understand how they became what they were and how their perspective got to the point that it was. Because there's an argument in the public milieu that actual malignant psychopaths and sociopaths don't deserve and shouldn't be given empathy. And the argument goes a little bit like, if we give them empathy, then what we're doing is we are in a kind of unguided and unmindful way meditating on what it would be like to be them. And the danger is that we can get lost in the God feeling of fulfilling all of your most basic narcissistic impulses. Because how the psychopath is made, how the bipolar type 2 is created, because for a long time, and still, the conversation about mass violence is that these people are born this way, that this is a genetic defect in the brain, and that there's nothing we can do about it. And the reason that's what's in the public milieu is because of what I've been learning and what I want to talk about. And it's hard to get into it without saying that I've been deeply wounded by these social movements. So in a lot of ways, I could say I'm reformed or I'm a survivor in the same way that various people who have survived cults are able to go out and do that and play the cult leader, the anti-cult leader in that regard. But that feels like what a politician would do, not what a philosopher would do. That doesn't feel true to my heart. And so what William James says is the way these people are made is very much the way Plato described how his people were. And Plato understood that there were minimum 2 levels of thought. There was the civilized barbarian of Athens, Greece, and there was the higher being, the higher thought, that had stepped outside of what he calls the cave, and into the light of reality, into the light of being. But Plato went to his death unsure whether he'd ever articulated that correct, and if what he experienced in his visionary experience was powerful enough to be true. So I'm going to tell you, rather than how Plato described it, or even exactly from William James' words, I'm going to describe it from my experience. What it requires to become someone like me, what it requires to become someone who is inclined at all toward religion and toward the religious experience, the profound enough religious experience to gather people around them and say, I have had a profound religious experience, and the way we are doing this is wrong, requires 2 things. It requires profound solitude, extended and profound solitude, indescribable solitude. And it requires even greater suffering. Segueing from that is difficult, because what I've just said is I've lived a life of profound solitude and suffering. My father used to tell me that mass violence was a natural conclusion for a man to come to, and a good one. That sometimes one's own suffering is so great that the only way to exit the world is to let the world know how much it had hurt you by hurting random people. And so I rejected that, along with very much most of what my father wanted to bequeath to me as a man. So I reject that outright, and I say no. And I ask, do these people that turned out to be, let's say, vampires, like May Otis Blackburn, or like the much more recent Love Has Won cult, these people who are very clearly potential malignant psychopaths, who have lived the lives of malignant psychopaths, or who have lived as the playthings of true malignant psychopaths, true Jeffrey's Dahmer. And when you spend time in the company of a vampire, whether you're enthralled by that vampire or you're that vampire's favorite non-thrall, when you spend time in the company of wolves, does it make you evil? And the answer seems to be, from the binary standpoint that our civilization has taken in saying that yes, trees that fall in the woods make a noise, that wolves are in themselves evil, because wolves are incapable of the higher plane of thought which can address whether they or anything is good or evil. You might be familiar with Friedrich Nietzsche. He wrote a book that I found as I was preparing for this. I thought, and I need to stop doing this, but I thought a phrase profoundly uninspiring called Beyond Good and Evil. Beyond Good and Evil was a book that I have read twice now, and which I have found incapable of finding wisdom in. In fact, I find myself incapable of answering the question, why not, i.e., why should this book not have been written in the positive? Well, it shouldn't have been written because of this or that positive character. All I can find when I read it is that this book should not have been published. Whether it should have been written is another matter, because Nietzsche had his own demons and died in madness. But the answer that they seem to say, as far as whether psychopaths are good or evil, is that psychopaths are evil. And now I've been trying to chase down where this comes from, because this is too simple a response, and it seems to be from the liberal fascists. And now, the liberal fascists is a phrase that people, I'm sure, like Weird Reads with Miss, whose name I can never remember, but she would probably push back on that. But what is true is that these religions are all politically liberal, and they're all fascist. And so if we understand feminism as what it is, and we understand feminism as a higher thought religion, a religion that understands that there are at least two planes of existence, planes of thought that one can occupy. One only has to read Simone de Beauvoir say that men are animals incapable of higher thought, and that women are genetically gifted with higher thought, to understand that we're talking about a religion when we're talking about feminism. And the only reason that men are allowed to participate is because wolves need sheep. Vampires need blood donors. They need thralls. That's just, it's in the nature of the being. And so it seems to me that, as Obi-Wan says, only Sith deal in absolutes. Only someone with something to hide deals in an absolute. Now, it seems that way to me because my education was post-Scopes monkey trial and was what I now understand is called oppositionally defiant of the Scopes monkey trial results. And what that means is, in our language, the language of the common people, the language of Reddit, that means it was maliciously non-compliant. It means it did the work. It educated the children the way the Scopes monkey trial said that we should educate the children, but that it did it in a way that, well, as they wanted to do. taught the controversy. And so if you're familiar at all with Flat Earth, or if you're familiar at all with the argument around creationism, you know what I'm talking about. The way the religious right has handled its business over the last 5 decades has been maybe even the last 8 decades. I think the Scopes Monkey trial was in the 50s. The way that they've dealt their business is to just pretend like it's still the 19th century, and the Scopes Monkey trial never happened, and the 1950s never happened, and it's still 1890. Okay. And so I think not just the feminist, but the liberal fascist, because whether you like it or not, Nazis are liberals. Okay? You only fight to the death with the groups that are closest to you, and the Nazis were anti-socialist and anti-communist, which means that they were anti-democracy, but they were only anti-democracy broadly. They were anti-democracy in deed, not in creed, and those are important distinctions. The creed of the Nazis was decidedly liberal, intentionally liberal. Now, they may have called back to the past, but they called back to an imaginary, visionary past. And that is not what conservatives do. Conservatives point back to an imaginary, visionary past of a living visionary, and they say his was the last. They don't have new visions. And so the liberals are the ones who created the new age. It's liberals who created Christian Science. It's liberals who are fascists, and it's liberals who came up with Tool and the racist neo-Aryan movement. It's liberals. It's not conservatives. Conservatives didn't need to invent these things and dig these things up out of the past and mistranslate them. Conservatives are about conserving the current translation as we have it today, because it's the one we got from our fathers and their fathers and their fathers before time. Conservatism is about proving the antiquity of your beliefs because you still have the relics, because you still have the buildings, you still have the bones, right? Liberalism is about proving the antiquity of your beliefs by making them up. I don't think Elena Blavatsky is her actual name. H.P. Blavatsky could not have been a conservative. She was inventing a Vedic system that predated the actual Vedic system that we have. That's not conservatism. So naturally I've lost my track. But I'm guiding you along a deep meditation. Hopefully you have your own thoughts on this, and maybe with any luck you'll leave me comments, and you'll like and you'll subscribe because you've thought about this in ways you've never thought. And maybe you'll realize over the course of the next week and month of subscribing here that you're thinking in ways that you've never thought before, and you'll realize that it hurts, and it is a form of suffering. And then you'll realize that everything that you've learned from Buddhism and Christianity and Islam and Judaism isn't a way out of the suffering. It's not a way through the suffering. It's not a true negation of suffering. It's an avoidance of suffering, when the goal should be a greater tolerance toward the suffering. And that brings me back to the psychopath. Because the psychopath learns as a small child in their isolation and their intense suffering to become obsessed with the question of happiness. And so, what is the American pathology? If the United States has... Boy, I will beat your head in. Stop that! If the United States has one particular pathology, it's the pursuit of happiness. And now, we don't just pursue happiness. When they wrote that, they weren't thinking in these terms, but they did mean to long distance run happiness down until it got exhausted and finally died, and then you could dine on it. That's what the pursuit of happiness is. And when we're talking about the foundation of when we're talking about the American forefathers, and we're talking about American conservatism, the pursuit of happiness is a slow pursuit. It's understanding that life and existence is suffering, and that happiness is temporary and temporal. And this is how your grandfather was able to get through retirement with a company that he hated and which disrespected him. You can't get through it because you have a pathological need to be happy at all times. Because what we don't understand and what we fail to remember is that happiness is a drug. The chemicals that create the state of joy, that create the state of happiness, those are drugs in your brain. The state of happiness is not the basal state of the human brain. The basal or base state of the human brain is terror. It's to be afraid, because you need to be afraid. We all need to be afraid. And let me tell you, as a person who was at least raised in an environment that aimed him toward a path at being a malignant psychopath, a malignant narcissistic psychopath, to whatever degree that I've missed that mark, you can decide. I know where I land on that mark, on that whatever target. I can relate to these people because I was raised in the same kind of environments. Often I was raised in the exact same environment as a lot of these people, whether it be serial killers or mass cultists or even potentially Jesus types themselves. Prophet types. World religion types. From our perspective, the pursuit of happiness becomes a pathology. It becomes an obsession. And that's how I wonder whether these people aren't vampires, and whether a wolf that realizes that doing good for a flock of sheep, who will then in turn pay him and one of their children once a month for a year, once a month, every 12 months a year, every year until he passes, and then continue that tradition with his children and his close friends and whatever, which is what religion is. Don't think that child sacrifice happened by accident. Someone came up with the idea, and he was most certainly a narcissistic, megalomaniacal psychopath, and he was absolutely a wolf. And it didn't necessarily need to be a he. I read enough antique literature that I understand that he is, in the English language, the word that just means they, and that if you call something a they, or you call it a them, or you call it a gender-neutral word, what you're calling it is an it, and you're definitely speaking in the plural. And so when we talk about people and we want to say, oh, well, the generic is they or them, what we're doing is we're saying, and we are acknowledging in our very language, that there are multiple people. And so what we're doing is, whether we're doing it on purpose because they are sick or we're making them sick, is we're definitely forcing a multiple personality type pathology on these people, on each other, on one another, at all times. And whether we're forcing it on them or they are embodying it because they're confused religiously and spiritually is indifferent. They're the same damn thing. You confuse people by forcing them. And that's just true. Fascism confuses people. So the answer is that the wolf isn't evil. That the wolf is only evil in context to the sheep. But when the wolf goes back to the wolf's family, especially if the wolf's family gets to partake, as I've described, gets to partake of that lamb once a month, every month, and that's their let's say major source of income, he's most certainly not evil to them. So to the high priests and the trafficking cults, the cults that traffic and evil do, while also fronting wildly good acts of goodness, to the people closest to them, they're not evil. even though to you they might be. And it's really a non-issue, I think, because I think I've talked about this in this space before. Something that I've thought about a lot is I was traumatized by the book Red Dragon. And now, I've talked about that in this space before, so you can hunt it down. I don't remember where. I'll talk about it a little bit in a moment, but what I was going to say, and I made myself forget because it's not something that you're supposed to admit anywhere, especially in public, is that because of the prolonged suffering and solitude that I endured as a child, I am biologically incapable of reacting to fear in the way that a typical human being is able to react to fear. Typical human beings react to fear with fight or flight. Now, there's also freezing and fawning. We've talked about that, I know. Most human beings react to fear by fleeing. Now, most males will fight to defend a fleeing loved one. But as aggressive a species as we are, we were not taking on lions. It was only the most suicidal of us who were taking on lions and leopards and tigers and bears and wolves and these specialized predatory killing machines when we were still running around in our skin. Even in the Middle Ages, when we were good enough to hunt boar and bear, we still had to have extremely specialized weapons, and somebody usually died. And so I am biologically incapable of fear in the same way that you are, so I can tell you that if any time during one of these meditations we find ourselves walking up to the void and I are good friends. I'm not going to let you fall into the void. Tell me if you trip. Anyway, now if you wander away from these meditations and fall in, that's not my fault, but I am here for you. Because I've been there. The void and I are good friends. Good friends. So being biologically incapable of fear, when we have a surreal experience, when we have an uncanny experience, those of us that William James would call psychopaths, and which today we might call bipolar type 2, or that we might say have undergone a profound ego death. Those of us, in other words, who exhibit autism spectra type traits, whether we are autism spectra or not, and are thus disinclined to imagination, when we have a vivid imaginatory experience, it does become powerful to the point of delusion. And those of us who are maybe unaware of our susceptibility, or who have only tasted that happiness that we didn't know to pursue in the visionary state, we can very often get stuck in that visionary state. That's what happened, or not, maybe not, that's not maybe not what happened in the example that I wanted to use. What happened in the example that I want to use is the other thing, that we can grow to prefer it. And that's definitely what happened with H.P. Lovecraft. If you read his work, especially the dreams and especially the poetry, he preferred his dream state to the waking state. And that's why he had so many hateful pathologies, is because he understood what I'm trying to articulate. And that is that when we have our first, we human beings, but especially we psychopaths, have type 2 bipolars. Remember, I'm using William James' psychopath, not Henry. Is it Henry Ronson? I know Henry Rollins is probably who I'm getting it mixed up with. But anyway, when we have the profound visionary experience, when we have what is very, very much a waking dream. Now, if you're listening to this and you were born after the 80s, you were encouraged to daydream. I've listened to an educator teach this to other educators and saying that since the 1980s, teachers have been grading children more on their imaginativeness in their answers than in the correctness of their answers. And now I've talked about this a lot on this space. But if you were born after the 1980s, you have been encouraged to be imaginative and to imagine and to have visionary experiences. We have normalized the childhood imaginary friend, and we've kind of internalized and made it normal that children do horror movie weird things. And the reason is something that higher thought incorporated very early, and that has been around among the, let's say, Gnostic or experiential, or the religions about personal knowledge of the divine, the democratization of divinity, let's say, and that you'll find me talking about in my very first episode when I talk about wokeness. It's they become aware when they wake up from the visionary experience that there are two minimum levels of consciousness. There's a lower or an earlier stage of consciousness, which is the consciousness that the brain inhabits until about 25 on average, in which I'm sure other people call, I'm sure I didn't make this up, but which I call, for the purposes of understanding it in my own mind, cyclical dream time. They wake up from their vision and they realize that they have been sleeping in cyclical dream time, and that their vision was the dream that's had immediately before waking. The most typically the dream that we remember best, or that we experience most vividly, is the one that we have right before we wake up. And so, and from the dream consciousness, dream sleep time, it feels like you go to sleep, you have this one dream, you wake up, and we know that there's 8 hours in between, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like that dream happened over the course of the 8 hours. But what is more true is that you had dozens of dreams over the course of that 8 or whatever hours that you were sleeping. And so, because people like me, people that have undergone intense isolation and that have undergone intense isolation, but what I mean to say is intense solitude and prolonged, indescribable suffering, is we stop dreaming. Really what happens is a lot of our traumas happen during the night, because a lot of us were subject to perverse adults, let's say. I was not, and not in that way. But I have unlocked trauma memories, because anymore when I go to sleep, it takes me about an hour for the panic and the fear to go away. And so what I'm trying to say is that very frequently people who are made into what William James calls psychopaths, they're made that way by being woken up in sleep, not allowed to sleep properly. And so we stop dreaming. And that's an interesting thing to say, because that also means we stop thinking about potential futures. We stop climbing up onto that place where we can look into the future and we can start to make plans for it. And that is one of the symptoms of ego death. And so what I mean to say is that people like me have undergone profound and damaging ego death. And frequently they haven't revived, reborn. This is a lot of language that's used in the New Age religious movements, and it's a lot of the language that's used in the Christian movement, for the very reason that the cult is intentionally, whether for good or evil, is from your perspective, I suppose, but what they're trying to do is initiate an ego death, because the religious experience is impossible without experiencing an ego death. The profound visionary experience is the result of ego death. Typically, they go hand in hand. Sometimes the profound visionary experience, like when we're talking about the Adventists, or we're talking about the I Am cult, the visionary experience is a result of a prolonged state of ego death, and it is the beginning of the initiation of the rebuilding of a new ego. And so what happens is, specifically in the cases of like the I Am movement with Ballard, I believe was his last name, what happened is that because of his potential psychopathy, and I even mean potential malignant narcissistic psychopathy, and maybe even narcissistic megalomaniacal malignant psychopathy, his failed business ventures and scams and his inability to provide for himself financially would have left him ego dead, in the sense that he would no longer know who he is or what his place in the universe is, and therefore nothing would have any meaning. Now, I don't know the specifics of his childhood well enough to talk about it, but I can talk about, if you are aware of and have had the self-harm influence for long enough, that's just the end of your story, where he got. That's just where it ends. But he had been in, let's say, lizard brain survival mode for so many decades that an end to the story was incomprehensible, although it was imminent. So what my therapist frequently says to me, and I've been thinking, well, why not? Why can't she be right about this? And why can't it work at every level of abstraction? Why can't I test it at least? Why not test it at every level of abstraction at least? Because if it's wrong at one, it can be wrong at multiple. And because of my particular trauma, what I'm ultimately trying to do is prove every piece of goodness that she gives me wrong. I talked about that with Destroying My Heroes. And so you put yourself back together with this visionary state where you imagine, what you do is, in the process of, because you've never had to create for yourself a vision, an impression, what we might say an understanding, a conception, you've never had to make for yourself an ego, you never had to make for yourself a self. You've never had any self-esteem because you never thought about it. And then the first time you think about it, you realize, oh, I've done a lot of bad things, and this should really be the end of the road for me. But if I make a profound change and become a good person, and what we need in order to make for ourselves an ego is a model. We need someone to act like, because behavior is just acting. And I do mean acting like on a stage or in a play. And so that's where fake it till you make it comes from, and it would have come directly out of, if not his mouth, someone close to him, maybe even his wife. Act like you have understanding, they say, and the universe will provide you understanding. Act like you've awoken from cyclical, non-linear, in other words, dream time. Act like you're awake to linear reality, the linear reality that incorporates all of history in a holistic and, magical way. Then you're allowed to manipulate the future. You're allowed to decide what the future is. And the very interesting thing to me, and thinking about all of this, and thinking about Mount Shasta, and thinking about the Ballards, they were a part of my teenage years in a way that I didn't understand and didn't know until I revisited them again with weird reads. And what I'm thinking about now is no longer them. Because I think that you might be thinking that I'm too close to these people. What I'm thinking about now is a lot of the stories that you read in John Keel. And now I like John Keel because there was never a scandal that came out of John Keel. There was never, besides his early days making things up and joking about having a lark in Germany, making things up about Nazis, and that you're frankly just allowed to do that. There's never come out anything about him hoaxing any of his reportage in the realm of the Fortean, not like the other guy who wrote on the Mothman events of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. I can't think. Brad Steger. Now see, it's either Steger or Steiger. Brad Steger had lots of admitted hoax reports. And so the first thing you learn, if you become interested in this, or at least you take an interest in this from a scientific skeptic point of view, is that magic, that is performative magic, or even, if you like, psychokinesis or whatever, parapsychology, that it's broken up into thirds. It works 1/3 of the time. And I heard everybody's favorite spoonbender, Uri Geller, explain this. That it works 1/3 of the time, and usually that 1/3 of the time it just works. You didn't really do anything. It just happened. 1/3 of the time it's never gonna work. It's just not gonna happen. And then the other third of the time, no one is around to see it when you made it happen on purpose. And so what that means is that these phenomena are impossible to observe in a lab, especially in a disbelieving lab, because a lot of what it requires is belief. And so what I'm saying, and what that means, is that when people like the Ballards, or Ballard himself, have this visionary experience, or like, I've been thinking about the sleeping prophet, Casey. Is it Edgar? Edgar Casey? I've been thinking about him a lot, and I've been thinking about Santa Claus in this context, and that belief is the cause by which the effect happens. But belief is a strange word in English. Belief is a word that means faith. And faith is a word that doesn't mean how we mean it. See, faith means blind trust in the way we say it. To have faith in someone means to just blindly believe in them, or like blindly, positively affirm them in our thoughts and in our body language and in our actions, including our speech. But that's not what faith is. Faith means to do what you're told, trusting that the higher power that commanded you is A, going to reward you, and B, in the right in their decisions. So it doesn't mean blindly. What it means is Exactly what it says. Trusting that everything is going to work out. That's what faith is. Faith is living your life trusting that things are going to work out, that you don't need to make important decisions. You just need to do what you're told effectively. But here's the thing. I can very clearly remember Christianity being confused about this in the 90s, because for 100 years, they had just been kind of competing with the New Age and the Adventist, etc. movements, which were quasi-Christian, and actually quasi-Christian in that they were combating Islam and Buddhism very broadly. The I Am movement is not Buddhist. It's very Christian. And so the roots of New Age actually come out of a sort of Christian fundamentalism, trying to recreate the Christianity of the first century. And what they didn't know they were doing was recreating Valentinian Christianity, which was a Gnostic heresy almost, and understood as heresy almost immediately. I mean, Augustine actually writes about how he wrote personal letters trying to explain to Valentinus how his magical kind of Christianity that included, erotic ritual was not at all what Jesus had in mind. And so why did looking for intellect and intelligence bring me to such a strange place? You might be wondering, if you're being a good active listener. Active listening is the key word that I needed to remember earlier but couldn't. Active listener. If you're being an active listener, you're asking questions but you're not hypothesizing them yet. You'll think about them later when you meditate on this meditation. You might even say ruminate on this rumination. And the answer is a very difficult one. This is going to take probably multiple parts. I might actually end up recording all of them tonight. If my mania is able to suspend my cognitive energy for it. But there's a mind-body problem. And I'm not really not sure what it is, because of my, and William James nomenclature, my psychopathy, because of my profound and prolonged isolation and suffering. I can very much remember, even before Psych 101, I can very much remember testing what things I had control of. Could I choose how fast my heart was going, slow or fast? Could I inflate my lungs until they hurt? Could I make myself return to automatic breathing? Which of the things could I take control of? And so from a very early age, and anime is a great metaphor for this, but I wasn't guided by anime when I was thinking about myself like this. I very much understood myself as the pilot of a machine. And now I would have understood myself as a pilot of a machine because, as I've said, I grew up in a maliciously non-compliant post-Scopes trial educational system that was telling me that science up to Darwin was right. And so the universe as Darwin and Isaac Newton understood it, the clockwork God was the way things was. Mechanistically. And so I used to sit and frequently I would lie on my back. But I can remember spending hours fiddling around. I mean, the language that we would really use is fiddling around inside my neurons for which clusters of my brain I had active control over and which ones I didn't, And then I can even remember as a child running until I was out of breath, and then seeing like whether I could more efficiently catch my breath than if I let my mind wander. And what I found is that if I didn't think about how I was out of breath, my body would just return to stasis on its own, and much faster than if I was dwelling on it. And so this is the same thing that the mind cure movement, higher thought, New Age, Christian Science, these are all synonyms really, but they're all different names for the thing in time and in place and among who's speaking. And so one of the things, I'm sure you've heard this. I know you've heard this because you have been on the internet before. I know you've been on Twitter and seen someone say, I'm thinking positive thoughts about money and it's going to appear in my bank account. That stuff comes out of this, what I'm talking about. And so what they believe is that if you just don't think about your illness, you don't observe it, you don't think about it, you don't manipulate it in your mind, and you imagine a future where you don't have the ache or pain or illness, it will go away. And the reason they believed that is because minor aches and pains and illnesses did. Addictions did and do. The religious experience is profound and inexplicable. I myself have undergone miracle healings of minor injuries. But I can remember, and I witnessed to this in a church when I was 20. I remember very much, I used to walk about 2 miles to work every day, and I had sprained my ankle. Something awful. Something horrible. It hurt so bad at all times. And I remember I walked into the church, and the pastor was doing the cult healing thing where he's like, all right, we're all going to close our eyes and we're all going to think positive thoughts, and everybody in here that has an injury is just going to focus on that injury and it's going to go away. And now the injury that I was thinking about, and I can remember this moment very clearly. I can go back there in my mind, and I can remember what I was thinking and what I was feeling and what I wanted to heal. And my heart, what I wanted to heal was my eyes. I wanted to be able to see without needing these glasses. I've always hated it. Since 6th grade, I've just always hated that my eyes aren't good. Always hated it. Not for any reason, not because it singles me out. Everybody else has glasses. I've just not liked it. I've just not liked it that the body that I was given wore out so quickly in that particular area. And so I remember thinking, let my eyes heal. And then I remember having a moment of saying, no, don't believe in that, because I remember at least 2 reasons. If I believed in it strongly enough and it happened, I would have to witness, and then it would become a thing. And I didn't want to be famous as the guy. I did not want to make friends and become famous in this church and be held up as the guy and on TV as the guy whose sight had been restored. I did not want that. And the other thing that I remember thinking is that if I believe as hard as I can and it doesn't happen, I'll be disappointed. And so the last thing I remember thinking is it would probably be better if it was my ankle. That would probably be more fitting to my situation and my humility, because my ankle hurt like a motherfucker. And healing my eyes would have been about vanity. Healing my ankle would have been about being able to get to work without limping. And my ankle, the pain was just gone. I could feel it. It was intensely hot, and then it was just gone. And it was just gone. It didn't come back. It was just gone. And that's real. And that's not anywhere approaching the only uncanny story I've ever had. And so my point is, and William James in The Varieties of Religious Experience, literally ad nauseum, tells stories of people witnessing to cures because they changed the frame of their mindset. They just stopped thinking about things in a negative way, and boom, they were suddenly happy. And so now we're back to, and the being happy, suddenly their body's not sick all the time. And, I mean, psychology in the 90s was obsessed with the psychosomatic cure, to the point now that the scientific skeptics say that, 50% of everything that happens is the placebo effect, and that the placebo effect is divorced from the mind-body problem altogether, to which I say, is it? Why is it not? Because the mind-body problem seems to me one wherein people who have it think that the mind is either that the mind exists in a superposition. Well, no, that's not right either. That the mind is one of two things. It exists as either one of two things, and it cannot be superimposed by those things. It is either a product of the body, or it is something happening to the body, the mind. And now, the language that they would use, and I told you we're going to avoid, is consciousness, but what I call the pilot. They say the pilot is either something that is produced by the body, or it's something that happens to the body, like the brain at a certain level of complexity becomes a radio receiver for the mind. And now that is a decidedly Christian idea, which means it's a decidedly older idea than that, in that the way I understood it before I understood Plato is I understood a column of light, and I understood myself as differentiated from that column of light, so myself as a point of light, maybe along that column somewhere, tethered to that column, but in all other respects unable to interact with that column. Very much I thought of myself as a radio on batteries receiving a signal. And that the radio, the body, has a finite amount of power, amount of life, but that the signal is infinite, because the signal appears to, at least among this human species, have a beginning with no end. And beginnings with no end seem to be the very religious mystery that kicks people out of non-linear or cyclical dream time, is realizing that you have a finite beginning and a finite ending, and time has a finite beginning and a finite ending, and the obsession in the 19th and 20th centuries with, let's just broadly call it Adventism or millennialism, or the impending doom that was coming for us all, which made sense after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, after that, you're like, yeah, impending doom is coming for us all, especially after the United States made the high moral move to allow their immediate rivals and active potential enemies, China and Russia, have at least weapons parity with them. Impending doom was right around the corner in 1960, 1970, 1980, 1990. I remember the wall falling. I remember not knowing why it was significant, but I remember everyone around me, all the adults, celebrating it like it was a big deal. So an impending doom, a coming end, has been our obsession. But I mean, just read Dan Carlin. The end is always near. The end has always been near. But the reason the end has always been near is because before the American experiment, and then before the consolidation of the American Empire after the Second World War, before that, there were ends in living memory. I mean, even during that. there are ends in living memory today. Like, I can remember Czechoslovakia becoming the Czech Republic and whatever, the Slovakia, whatever the actual name of that country is. I'm sorry for not knowing. Civilizations, like, think of the Ottoman Empire. You know, in this time period and every time period really before our own, it was really, I swear to God, all of my research, my life experience as I remember it, because I was intentional and mindful, and I was actively listening and paying attention as a child. I remember the 90s. I remember the 90s better than my contemporaries, and probably better than you if you were an adult during the 90s. I get into conversations with people who are 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years older than me all the time about how they misremember these eras. And I get emotional about it, and I get agitated, and I let it show. I am emotional and I am agitated right now. I want to be funny, but you know. It's so hard. I wanted to be better at this. I wanted this one to be better. This one's, I don't know. Probably gonna end up editing this one because I feel like I have to gather my thoughts a lot. I have a lot of trauma wrapped up in this and understanding this. This has been 20 years more, so many more. I'm 36. The first thing I can remember is trying to figure this out. But I really no longer know what I'm talking about, do I? I mean, I've introduced the mind-body problem like it's not a problem to me because I've always understood it in a way that I thought was full, but then I didn't realize that it was obviously incomplete until I had run across Plato, and then now I'm realizing that the whole higher thought, the whole New Age, our entire educational system, our political system, all of our religious systems, they're all incomplete because they're all trying to manipulate the shadows that are allowed to be beamed into the cave. They're all trying to control the stimuli of the culture so they can predict and manipulate the reactions of the sheep, the bovine, lower thinking human beings who are their responsibilities. And if you understand that they understand that we are their responsibilities and keeping us stupid so we're not afraid is in our best intentions, you can kind of understand how, like, Nancy Pelosi can be Nancy Pelosi, and you can kind of understand how liberal fascists, can believe in their own minds that they're doing what's best for the greatest number of people, and that the greatest good for the greatest number was the answer that enlightenment of the, let's say, 18th and maybe let's say the 17th and 18th centuries leading into the 19th century, the greatest good for the greatest number is how we got to higher thought is okay, well, if the people who can think about this in a way that can lead to the greatest good, then those people are on a higher plane of thought. They occupy a higher plane of existence even. Those people are closer to God. Literally, this is what the woke movement wants you to believe. That the particular leaders of the woke movement, whether it be the Black Lives Matter group, which is a cult which has exposed itself in recent months as a cult, and as the kind of cult that I'm talking about, where I'm talking about narcissistic, malignant psychopaths in our language, right? People who haven't actually undergone the isolation and suffering needed in order to be a generational genius is also a term that William James used, and that Jordan Peterson has co-opted for himself, because what seems to have happened is after Jordan Peterson, I believe, from context of having read the book now twice, that the Varieties of Religious Experience was actually a lecture series that he gave in Scotland. And so what happened is that people read that book, people went to that lecture, and they misunderstood, and then they lived their lives and taught their students and taught their children misunderstandings about that literature. Because that book is almost a how to be a cultist of personality. So if you're the kind of person like Robert Jordan who desperately wants to be a cultist of personality because you know you have a finite amount of time on this mortal coil and you believe that founding a cult around your personality is how you can do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, well, I mean, the math is obvious, isn't it? So what seems to happen is we have this profound visionary experience, and the profound visionary experience seems to go in one way. We see how things began, how things got to here, and where things need to go. And the reason, like Ballard had to do, we tend to create these extra us personalities that we communicate and that nobody else can, whether they be the Comte de Saint-Germain, or, the angel Gabriel, or Satan, or Jesus, or, like Muhammad had, I believe Muhammad had Gabriel. You have these extra personal, extra you characters that you speak to and have being, and sometimes, they'll even act like they're right there with them. If you're familiar with Theosophists, with the whole medium thing where they inhabit their body and speak through their voice, right? Like, this experience is an imaginary experience. This is the same thing that happens to people like Heath Ledger, right? This is the same thing that actors go through. And it's the same brain structures. The difference is the height from which you're able to think about yourself. And that really means the height to which you're able to climb above yourself and look back down on yourself. And so what that is a proof that the 19th and 20th centuries were right. There are degrees of thought, and people can occupy higher or lower planes of them. Degrees of them. And this is why that thinking came out of the mystery schools. And specifically, it came out of Freemasonry, which was an intentional recreation of the mystery schools. And I don't think they actually knew by the modern era, by the time I'm talking about, the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. I don't think by the time the Freemasons were the Freemasons the way we think of them, they really believed. I don't think they really believed that they had the old rituals and they had the old thought, and that they understood things the way the ancientist cultists or the ancientist mystery schools. And a mystery is a secret, and a secret is the secret is the techniques to getting visual, not just visual experiences, but also the techniques of recreating a person after they've had the visual experience. So the mystery schools were a place where you could go and eat hallucinogens, have a trip, and then be put back together as a better person without, in exactly the same way that psychology wants to do it now. You go, you eat the LSD, you don't need to smoke anymore. You go, you eat the LSD, you don't need to beat your girlfriend up anymore. Whatever it is, the mystery, the secret, the thing that they're keeping secret, or that they're keeping away from you, is the thing with the effect. Whether it be the ayahuasca, or whether it be the isolation chamber, or whether it be, even just the confession booth. The mystery, the secret, there is whatever thing they're not telling you how it works, but it has an effect because you just had an experience. And it was profound enough to stop you from doing whatever the thing was before. So a lot of people blame and say that, in the modern era, that this stuff all comes out of Mesmer. And I don't think they're wrong. Because what Mesmer was doing was the same thing the Egyptian and the Greco-Egypto-Roman mystery cults were doing, the same thing the Dionysians were doing, and the very same thing Jesus did if he did the Last Supper. Now, I've been thinking in my own quest that the Last Supper and the Father, why have you forsaken me, the last moments on the cross, might be fictional dramatizations. A lot of the Jesus story might be a fictional dramatization, because 70 years is a long time to wait to write out the story, or to have, well, 70 years is a long time, is long enough that the folklore can become folklore. We know that if you're interested in American folklore. Fuck, if you're interested in if you're interested in the Mothman prophecies, the people that experienced it, they've all left. I think they're all gone from us now. And so all we have is what accounts they have on video and what accounts they wrote. And without those things and the Jesus thing, it's really hard to know how much of any of that is fictional. And so that's why we think belief is blind faith. But that's not true. Because when you accept the Christian religion, sure, you're accepting that Jesus did all these things and all these things are fact. But what you're doing is believing on, and not on blind faith, you're believing on understanding faith that your future is different now. And that's what the visionary experience is. And for these megalomaniacal psychopaths, when they see the future, and they've never seen the future before, they've never lived with a meaningful past, they have been asleep to linear time, the linear non-dream space, let's say linear reality. If they've been asleep to that and they wake up and then they tell people, I have woken up, and we exist in linear time. And in linear time, this is how the mind-body problem is solved. Well, people who understand because they've been told they're in dreams and dream sleep, that they live in non-linear dream time. Well, they want to know how to wake up to non-linear dream time too. From non-linear dream time too, they want to know how to wake up to cyclic or to linear time. And if it's as easy as going to this church and listening to this guy say, just think positive thoughts and trust that I have seen above the firmament, because that's what it is. It's a stepping outside of the firmament of what is allowed to be viewed with the regular eye, and then see what's not available to the regular eye. But we understood that as what was happening with the microscope. And then we definitely understood that as what was happening with the telescope. We understood that we were peering outside of what was available to animals to see, because we understood until Darwin that the difference between us and animals is very nil. And then when Darwin said, whoa, the difference between us and animals is actually nil, is when we had a problem with it, because animals aren't capable of higher thought. But you can teach animals to evince higher thought. One of the things I've been working with my trio of rat boys is sharing, because sharing is caring, and caring is compassion. It's co-suffering. To care about something is to suffer for it. The word care in English means to suffer. So the word to care means to suffer. And so when you care for someone, or care with someone, or care after someone, or send your caring to someone, is what you're telling them is that you're empathetically or empathically, you're feeling or thinking about their suffering. And so sharing something that someone wants that you have with someone is suffering with them. It's understanding, oh, you're suffering because you don't have this thing that you want that I have. Well, here, you have it, and now I care. I'm showing that I care. Now I'm suffering because I don't have it, but you have it. And what we don't understand is that exchange doesn't leave a debt. See, because what is apparently from the modern, the very modern atheistic, autistic, narcissistic standpoint is that, let's say I have a loaf of bread. You don't have a loaf of bread. You're not starving. You just would like my loaf of bread. That would make you happy, because maybe you haven't eaten yet today and it's mealtime and I'm not going to eat the loaf of bread. Maybe I don't even want the damn loaf of bread, right? But you do. And so I give it to you. And now in our economic exchange, what I now have is -1 loaves of bread. I don't have 0 loaves of bread. I now have -1 loaves of bread. And what isn't true is that I have -1 loaves of bread. I have 0 loaves of bread. And the +1 that they're accounting for that I don't have, the one, that the thing, the something, the void that I now have, is the pleasure of having the thing. But what I do have is not a void, but I have something filling the space that they call a void, and it's called happiness. Because the truest happiness is doing something effortless that makes somebody else a +1, makes somebody else happy. And what we want most of all, and what religion is about, and what cult is about, and what culture is about, is finding that place where you can volunteer your goodness. You can volunteer that thing that makes other people happy, that doesn't leave a void in you. And see, this is why I don't like introverts. Anyone who describes themselves as an introvert, I instantly dislike as a person. I find that announcing it out loud, identifying as an introvert, I find that to be a personality flaw. Because there is no actual energy exchange between people. When someone says, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" They're giving you positive energy by asking. By engaging with you, that connection to you is actually giving something of them to you. And so if you see that as them taking something from you, you are in fact a vampire. You're a narcissist. You're a malignant, narcissistic psychopath. And you are actually doing harm to everyone around you. And the best thing you can do, and the reason, in fact, you identify as a introvert, is isolate yourself from people, because you haven't actually felt enough profound suffering yet to become bipolar or to become a person who hurts people. But you are a person who doesn't know that you take joy in hurting people emotionally. So the best thing you can do, introvert, is stay the fuck away from everyone. But that's what makes you happy, and that's why it makes you happy, is because you're a narcissist. And so we're back to the pursuit of happiness. And Americans pathologizing the pursuit. Pursuing happiness. Chasing it down like wolves. And then like wolves becoming ravenous. That's interesting. Like wolves becoming like ravens. But what do ravens do? They just flock to whatever's dead and they eat it. They flock to whatever's dead or dying and they eat it. And so I don't know whether it's a myth or not, but let's call it a myth of the bloodthirsty wolf, the wolf that just gets a taste for human blood. Or, like they used to say, I grew up around dog kennels. I grew up around people who kept dogs and kept them in a semi-feral state, where they used to believe that if a dog bit you and got a taste of your blood, it would just want more, right? But that's, whether it's a myth or not, it's true of people. And so what we do is we understand people. We understand animals in the way we understand people. We don't reverse engineer people out of animals, because we have an unconscious and habitual understanding of higher thought, that it goes animals, people, and then the higher levels of people. And so there's this assumption that we're just better all around than animals. And that's why malignant narcissistic psychopaths begin their evolution toward hurting human beings and hurting animals herding as well. Shepherding animals is where they learn to shepherd people, because it's like I described. If you can teach a rat to, when you're giving out treats, if you can teach the one that gets the treat first to go and give his treat to the other, and then if you give him another one, he gives the treat to the other, that he'll get 2. If you can teach them that, you can teach a child that. And if you can teach a child that, you can teach an adult that. And if you can teach an adult that, you can teach an entire city that. And, if you can, conceptually, if you can teach an entire city, you can teach an entire nation. And if you can teach a nation, you can teach the whole world. That sharing is caring, that freely giving of yourself isn't a debt, that you don't suddenly now have less than what you had, or less than zero because you don't have the thing. You actually have more than you had if you have even a little bit of happiness. And I can reverse engineer this as true because people who could have become malignant psychopaths, even malignant psychopaths like Charles Manson, continue to make cults that make people happy. And what they're doing is chasing the happiness of making people happy, even if what makes people happy is doing abhorrent things. And so it does make you wonder about people like Epstein. It makes you wonder whether they thought they were doing a broadly good thing, and that those hurt were at the level of inconsequentiality, like the Carthaginians thought about their child slavery. Not the child slavery, their child sacrificing. But the Romans, occupying a higher evolutionary level of thought, understood that sacrificing children for any reason is abhorrent, because magically getting one potentiality that you prefer by sacrificing potentiality itself, and what is a child if not potential, is abhorrent. And so that brings me back to my childhood. And maybe that's next episode. Yeah, so let's stitch this up a little bit. The cult of personality is the result of a person who could be malignant, wanting in whatever way to do good and to do the greatest amount of good, even if their reasons are pure evil. So what is a politician then? Why get into government? I can understand getting into religion. And one of the things that I think about when I do this is, okay, so like, do I then just become John Coe of the family? Is that his first name? I think his last name is Coe. Do I just become like the guy of the family? Do I become one of these religious revivalists who understands that the only way you're going to actually affect positive change in the lives of people once they leave your church is if the people leaving your church also go and get involved in government and local business? So is my goal here to get sponsored by Reebok? And so I'm on Reebok ads saying be a good person, do your best, just do your best, and do your best to take time to think meaningfully about yourself and what you're doing and whether it's positively impacting people, and how even if it is, you could positively impact more people in a better way. Because if more people did that, more people would exit the public stage. Jordan Peterson, for instance, would disappear. Ben Shapiro would disappear. Like everybody at the Daily Wire, even the little black girl, would disappear. They would just remove themselves from the public sphere. And see, the reason they don't is actually a very good one. And it's one that we should meditate on here at the end. And we should really think, well, why are these people who are actual cancers to our society, why don't they remove themselves? Why can't they elevate their thinking in such a way that they're able to think about themselves? And they're able to realize that what they're doing is actually causing great harm. And the reason is Socrates. Because they wouldn't just exit the public sphere. They wouldn't just retire. They would do what Miller did. Miller of the Millerite movement. I think he was a John also. He might have been a William. Doesn't matter. I think it's William, actually. They wouldn't live. They wouldn't outlive their retirement. It was, months or just a handful of years that after Miller's failed prophecy that, Jesus was going to come back in his life, that he just disappeared into the woods and left the world. Because that's what you do when you realize that your holistic system that you've been teaching people is wrong. That's the only correct thing to do, is to realize what Socrates realized, is that the truest wise person, the truest knowing person, the most intelligent person understands that they know nothing and can teach nothing. All they can do is ask why and why not. But Christianity taught us that there is a redemption possible. And so the family is maybe the very reason that our politicians don't fall on their own swords, and that people like Jordan Peterson don't burn their own books and disappear into obscurity. And it's the belief that just doing your best, God will illuminate the truth in your error. That it's being a wolf that makes us redeemable. That stepping out of being a sheep puts us in the position of being one of two things: a threat to the sheep, a wolf, or a shepherd. And if we find ourselves in the position to be shepherds, but preying on our flock, we have to understand that farmers eat their sheep. That's not only their livelihood, having beautiful, healthy, well-groomed, happy fucking sheep, but that those are the ones that also taste the best. And so is a farmer evil? Well, the liberal fascist answer is that anything short of veganism is evil. But then I have the question for that, because plants feel pain. Plants communicate. Plants defend themselves from predators. So is the only act of good from the liberal fascist good the self-end? Is the only true life the life of the Buddhist ascetic who mummifies himself in life, who eats sawdust so his insides will be dry? Thank you for listening. This has been the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. You've been listening to Shaggy Dog Philosopher. I'm going to talk at you real soon.